The year 1917 was a difficult one for the Russian Empire. People simply did not have enough food, there was an economic crisis, and military action led by illiterate generals. Not very favorable conditions for stability. As a result, there was the Russian Revolution. It is worth noting that it is not a single event, a whole series of events from the overthrow of the Tsar and ending with the emergence of the Soviet republics. The revolution sealed Russia's fate for the rest of the 20th century, not only leading to the rise of industrialization in the country, but also popularizing communism throughout the world. Let us imagine what would have happened if the Russian Revolution had never happened. This revolution involves two major events, the February Revolution and the October Revolution. What if the February Revolution had never happened? Emperor Nicholas I would have remained in power. By that time there was already a Duma in the Russian Empire. This was done to appease the people who demanded reforms after the 1905 revolution, but in reality the Duma had no power. In our alternative reality, instead of restricting the Duma, Nicholas I would have given it more legislative rights, while turning Russia toward a constitutional monarchy. Although even with this, it is very unlikely that the emperor would have been able to retain power, because the most influential factor leading to the fall of the Tsarist regime was the PVM. And so with Russia participating in World War I, revolution becomes inevitable. Russia could not win the war against the Central Powers. At that time the empire, although there was a growth of industry, but it still lagged behind many countries in terms of development and was absolutely unprepared for such a war. The blockade of the Ottoman Empire hit the Russian economy, and German victories on the front shook the imperial regime, so the Tsar had little chance of staying in power. In fact, there were only two ways to avoid a revolution. The first was to give broad powers to the Duma and democratize political life, and the second was for Russia not to join the PVM. Both options are virtually unrealistic and implausible, but let's assume that it did happen. World War I broke out all over Europe, but Russia does not take part in it. It would have changed a lot for her. It would have remained a predominantly agrarian country with an uneducated population, the monarchy not really caring about the welfare of the people. Although Soviet policies were extremely repressive and resulted in many deaths, they nevertheless brought tremendous industrialization to the country and virtually eliminated illiteracy. Even in our alternate time, the Russian Empire remains behind the most developed European countries such as Britain or France. Perhaps, in time, the Tsarist government would have been able to carry out complete industrialization, but it would have taken more than a decade. National movements in Poland, Armenia, and Finland would have been problems for Russia in the future. In global processes, our country would not have been as significant and hostile as it was in the 20th century and continues to this day. For example, the Cold War destroyed all ties with Western countries, so in our time Russia would have been more loyal to Western countries. But moving on to the second question, what if the October Revolution had not happened? In this alternate reality, the Tsar was overthrown and a provisional government was established, but the communists failed to stage a coup and the provisional government remained in power. It should have been more socially oriented, because they would have been more focused on the welfare of the peasants and would have been more democratic than the Bolsheviks. To stay in power, the provisional government would have had to surrender to the war, for the war at the time was not satisfactory to most of the population, so the country could quickly get out of the war and deal with more meaningful problems. But it is difficult to predict who would have replaced the provisional government. If Lenin had not come to power, the whole history of the 20th century would have been overturned. There never would have been a civil war, many Russians would not have died, and the Romanov dynasty would still exist. In this alternate time, without the Soviet Union and Marxism influencing the world, many of those events would not have happened. For example, Mao Zedong would never have come to power, and the Vietnam War would not likely have happened either. Socialist ideas would also have spread around the world, but not in the way the Bolsheviks did. The United States without the fear of the Cold War and communism would probably have been more loyal to the socialists. It is hard to say whether Hitler would have come to power or not, since his program was always based not only on anti-Semitic statements, but also on anti-communist propaganda. For Russia, the main difference is that Russian culture would have had a chance to grow and develop, because communism had largely destroyed the traditional culture of the Russians, and only now they are trying to revive it. The Russian Revolution has become so influential in the world that it is difficult to know for sure how many other world events it has affected.